Picture this: a world where two of history's mightiest city-states, Athens and Sparta, stand on the brink of an all-consuming war, their fates intertwined in a struggle that would shape the course of civilization. This wasn't just a conflict of armies, it was a battle of ideologies, a clash between democracy and militarism, ambition and tradition. The Peloponnesian War, spanning 27 grueling years, became one of the most defining chapters of the ancient world, a saga filled with heroism, treachery, and moments that altered history forever. And here's the thing, it's not just a story locked in the past. The echoes of this war resonate even today, in the way nations rise and fall, in the strategies leaders employ, and in the timeless lessons about power and its pitfalls. What made this war so extraordinary? It wasn't just the scale or the stakes, it was the sheer unpredictability of it all. One moment, Athens, with its golden age of art and philosophy, seemed unstoppable, its navy ruling the waves. The next, Sparta, the relentless warrior society, would strike back with brutal efficiency, and caught in between were countless lives, alliances forged and broken, and cities caught in the crossfire. This was a war where cunning often outweighed brute strength, where a single speech could rally a nation or doom it, and where figures like Pericles, the visionary leader, and Alcibiades, the brilliant but treacherous general, became legends. But beyond the famous names, this was a story of ordinary people, soldiers, citizens, even slaves whose lives were forever changed by the decisions of a few. So why revisit this ancient conflict now? Because the Peloponnesian War is more than just a tale of battles and politics, it's a mirror held up to human nature. The ambitions, the miscalculations, the moments of courage and despair, they're all threads in a story that feels startlingly modern. Over the course of this video, we'll journey through 32 pivotal events that defined this war, from the opening moves to the final, crushing defeat. You'll witness sieges that stretched for years, naval battles that turned the tide, and betrayals that rewrote history. And by the end, you won't just understand what happened, you'll see how this ancient struggle still speaks to us, reminding us of the price of power, the weight of decisions, and the enduring lessons of history. So let's step back into the world of spears and triremes, of marble temples and smoky battlefields, and uncover the epic story of Athens versus Sparta, a clash of titans that still captivates us today. To truly understand why Athens and Sparta locked into this decades-long struggle, we need to look beyond simple rivalry. These weren't just two cities competing for territory, they represented entirely different ways of life. Athens, the shining beacon of democracy, thrived on trade, philosophy, and naval dominance. Its streets buzzed with debate, its theaters staged timeless tragedies, and its harbor brimmed with ships connecting it to distant lands. Sparta, by contrast, was a society forged in iron discipline. From childhood, its citizens trained for war, valuing strength and simplicity over wealth or art. Their entire culture revolved around producing the finest soldiers the world had ever seen. The tension between these two powers had been simmering for generations, but what turned it into a full-blown war? Much of it came down to two competing alliances. Athens led the Delian League, originally formed to protect Greek cities from Persian invasion. Over time, though, it became more like an Athenian empire. Member states paid tribute, and Athens used that wealth to build monuments like the Parthenon while expanding its influence. Sparta, meanwhile, headed the Peloponnesian League, a looser alliance of city-states that deeply distrusted Athens' growing power. trade disputes and territorial squabbles added fuel to the fire. When Athens intervened in conflicts between smaller cities, Sparta saw it as aggression. When Sparta's allies complained about Athenian dominance, Athens viewed it as jealousy. And beneath it all lay a fundamental clash of values. Could a society built on free thought and naval commerce coexist with one devoted to martial tradition and land-based power? The answer, tragically, was no. The final spark came in 431 BCE, when a small conflict between Corinth, Sparta's ally, and Korsaira, a neutral state seeking Athenian help, escalated beyond control. Athens' decision to intervene tipped the scales. Sparta, bound by alliances and fearing Athenian ambition, could no longer stand aside. What followed wasn't just a war, it was a reckoning, a test of which vision of Greece would prevail. And as we'll see, neither side could have predicted just how devastating that test would become. Long before the Great War that would consume Greece, an earlier conflict between Athens and Sparta revealed just how explosive their rivalry could be. The First Peloponnesian War, often overlooked in the shadow of its more famous successor, was where the tensions first erupted into open hostility. It began in 460 BCE, when Athens saw an opportunity to extend its influence by allying with Megara, a strategically vital city-state controlling key land routes near the Isthmus of Corinth. For Sparta, this move was a direct threat. Megara's allegiance to Athens meant their rival could now choke off land access to the Peloponnese, Sparta's heartland. What followed was a series of skirmishes and sieges that exposed the strengths and weaknesses of both powers. Athens, relying on its formidable navy, launched daring raids along the coasts, while Sparta's land forces marched north, testing Athenian defenses. The fighting was fierce but inconclusive, a back-and-forth struggle that drained both sides without delivering a decisive blow. Then came a twist no one expected. A massive earthquake struck Sparta in 464 BCE, leveling homes and killing thousands. In the chaos, Sparta's oppressed Helot population rose in revolt, forcing the Spartans to focus inward just as Athens pressed its advantage. Yet Athens, too, faced setbacks. Its ambitious campaigns in Egypt ended in disaster, costing ships, soldiers, and prestige. By 445 BCE, exhaustion set in, and the two powers agreed to the so-called 30 Years' Peace. But the name was misleading. This wasn't true peace, it was a tense ceasefire, a temporary halt to hostilities that left wounds unhealed. Sparta never forgot Athens' aggression, and Athens resented the limits placed on its expansion. The treaty's terms forbidding allies from switching sides did little to ease the underlying distrust. Megara became a symbol of that lingering bitterness. When it later revolted against Athens, Sparta's refusal to intervene as promised fueled Athenian suspicions. Meanwhile, smaller states watched nervously, caught between two giants whose rivalry threatened to drag them all into chaos. The First Peloponnesian War proved one thing beyond doubt: Athens and Sparta couldn't share power peacefully. Their ideologies were too opposed, their ambitions too vast. And when the 30 Years' Peace finally shattered, the war that followed wouldn't be a mere skirmish, it would be a fight to the death. The island of Korsaira, known today as Corfu, became the unlikely flashpoint that pushed Greece toward all-out war. In 433 BCE, this prosperous maritime state found itself locked in a bitter dispute with Corinth, one of Sparta's most powerful allies. The conflict began over Epidamnus, a distant colony caught in a political tug of war, but it quickly spiraled into something far greater. When Corinth sent a fleet to punish Korsaira for interfering, the smaller island turned to Athens for help, and in doing so, forced the Athenians into an impossible choice. Backing Korsaira meant directly challenging Corinth, risking the wrath of Sparta's entire alliance. But refusing would hand a crucial naval base to Corinth, tipping the balance of power in the Aegean. Athens, under the leadership of Pericles, chose to act. They offered Korsaira a defensive alliance, sending just enough ships to deter Corinth without appearing overtly aggressive. It was a calculated gamble, a way to project strength while avoiding outright war. But calculations can misfire. The two sides clashed near Sabota in a chaotic naval battle that foreshadowed the brutal years to come. Athenian triremes, sleek and fast, darted between Corinth's heavier vessels, their tactics showcasing the innovation that had made Athens dominant at sea. Yet the engagement ended indecisively. Corinth claimed victory, but Korsaira, bolstered by Athenian support, survived. The real damage wasn't measured in sunken ships but in shattered trust. Sparta saw Athens' intervention as proof of unchecked ambition, while Corinth, humiliated and furious, pressed for retaliation. What made this moment so pivotal wasn't just the battle itself but the precedent it set. Athens had crossed a line, choosing strategy over caution, and in doing so, revealed a truth both sides had long avoided. Diplomacy was no longer enough. The Peloponnesian League now had a rallying cry, a concrete grievance to justify war, and Athens, for all its naval brilliance, had underestimated the depth of Spartan resolve. The skirmish at Sabota wasn't the first clash between Greek cities, but it was the first spark in a fire that would consume the entire region. Behind the political maneuvering lay a deeper irony. Korsaira itself, the prize both sides fought over, would later descend into civil war, tearing itself apart in a brutal preview of the chaos to come. The island's strife mirrored the larger conflict, a reminder that in this struggle, no city, no ally would remain untouched. Athens' decision to intervene might have seemed like cold realpolitik, but its consequences would be anything but controlled. The road to war was paved with choices like these, each one narrowing the path to peace. Potidaea was a ticking time bomb in the already volatile relationship between Athens and Sparta. This northern Greek city, though technically an Athenian ally, held deep ties to Corinth, its mother colony, creating a dangerous split loyalty. In 432 BCE, that tension erupted into open rebellion when Potidaea, emboldened by secret Spartan promises, threw off Athenian rule. For Athens, this wasn't just a revolt, it was a direct challenge to their authority, one they couldn't ignore. Their response was swift and brutal, a full-scale siege that would drag on for years, becoming a symbol of the war's grinding futility. What made Potidaea so explosive wasn't just its defiance, but its strategic position. Located on the narrow isthmus of Pallene, the city controlled vital trade routes linking Athens to its grain supplies in the Black Sea. Losing it would weaken Athenian commerce while handing Sparta's allies a key foothold in the north. Athens moved decisively, sending a fleet and thousands of hoplites to surround the city's walls. But sieges in this era were grueling affairs, and Potidaea's defenders, reinforced by Corinthian volunteers and Spartan advisors, dug in for a fight. The Athenians found themselves trapped in a war of attrition, their navy blockading the coast while their troops weathered disease and dwindling supplies in the muddy trenches outside the city. The human cost was staggering. Ancient sources describe Athenian soldiers resorting to eating the leather from their own sandals as hunger set in. Inside Potidaea, conditions grew even worse. Starvation, overcrowding, and desperation became daily realities. Yet neither side would back down. Sparta, though unwilling to commit its full army, funneled support through its allies, turning Potidaea into a proxy battleground. Corinth, eager to avenge its humiliation at Korsaira, poured resources into the defense. Athens, meanwhile, saw the siege as a test of its imperial resolve. To withdraw would embolden other restless allies. To continue meant bleeding money and lives in a distant stalemate. This wasn't just a military struggle, it was a psychological turning point. The prolonged suffering at Potidaea stripped away any illusions of a quick or clean war. It revealed how easily a local dispute could escalate into a broader conflict, drawing in great powers through webs of alliance and pride. Most critically, it poisoned the diplomatic well. When Sparta demanded Athens lift the siege as a condition for peace, Athens refused, seeing the demand as interference in its rightful domain. The standoff confirmed what many feared: compromise was impossible. By the time Potidaea finally fell in 429 BC, the wider war had already begun. The city's ruins stood as a grim preview of what was to come, a cycle of rebellion, repression, and ruin that would repeat across Greece. But in those early days, the siege taught a bitter lesson. Once the wheels of war start turning, they're nearly impossible to stop. Every death at Potidaea, every wasted resource, only deepened the resolve on both sides to fight until one power stood alone. The Megarian decree wasn't just a trade restriction. It was an economic stranglehold designed to break an enemy without drawing a single sword. In 432 BC, Athens made a calculated move, banning Megara from its bustling markets and harbors across the Aegean. For a city like Megara, whose survival depended on maritime trade, this was a death sentence. Ships laden with goods were turned away, merchants faced ruin, and the flow of grain and timber dried up overnight. But the real target wasn't just Megara, it was Sparta. Athens knew this small, defiant city was a key Spartan ally, and by squeezing its economy, they were sending a message: defy us and you'll pay the price. Sparta's reaction was immediate and furious. They saw the decree as more than an insult. It was a direct assault on the delicate balance of power in Greece. Sparta's leaders, bound by honor and alliance, demanded Athens repeal the ban. But Athens, confident in its naval supremacy and the strength of its walls, refused. The stage was set for war, and the Megarian decree became the final straw. What's fascinating about this moment isn't just the political brinkmanship, it's how clearly it reveals the unseen weapons of ancient warfare. Trade embargoes, economic pressure, and resource control could be just as devastating as any phalanx or trireme. Megara's suffering became a rallying cry for Sparta's allies, proof of Athenian overreach. Corinth, still seething from the conflict at Korsaira, pointed to Megara as a warning. No city was safe under Athens' shadow. Even neutral states watched nervously, realizing how easily their own fortunes could vanish with the stroke of a pen. The decree exposed the fragility of Greek diplomacy, where commerce and conflict were inextricably linked. Yet the irony was thick. Athens, the city that celebrated democracy and open debate, had weaponized trade, an act that felt more like tyranny to its rivals. Pericles, the architect of the decree, argued it was a justified response to Megara's provocations, but history would remember it differently. This wasn't just policy, it was pride. And in the end, it would cost Athens dearly. The Megarian decree didn't just escalate tensions, it lit the fuse for a war that would consume Greece, proving that sometimes the most destructive battles aren't fought with spears, but with scrolls and seals. Archidamus II, Sparta's seasoned king, marched his army into Attica in 431 BC with a single, devastating goal: to force Athens into open battle. But Athens refused to play by Sparta's rules. Instead of meeting the invasion head-on, Pericles convinced his people to abandon their farms and retreat behind the towering long walls, a decision that would define the war's early years. Spartan soldiers torched olive groves, razed villages, and left fields smoldering, expecting the Athenians to emerge in fury, but the city gates remained shut. This was a war of patience versus pride. Sparta's strength lay in its hoplites, the heavily armored warriors who dominated land battles. Yet those same warriors now stood helpless before Athens' walls, watching their destruction yield no surrender. Meanwhile, Athenian triremes sliced through the Aegean, striking Spartan allies and securing vital grain shipments from the Black Sea. Pericles' strategy was clear: let Sparta exhaust itself in Attica while Athens tightened its grip on the sea. The invasion revealed a brutal truth: war wasn't just about courage or tactics, but endurance. Spartan soldiers, unaccustomed to prolonged campaigns, grew restless as months passed with no decisive victory. Back in Athens, though, the crowded city became a tinderbox of disease and discontent. Refugees packed into makeshift shelters, and the stench of overcrowding hung thick in the air. The very walls meant to protect them now felt like a cage. Archidamus' campaign marked the beginning of the Archidamian War, but it also exposed a paradox. Sparta could ravage the land, yet it couldn't land a killing blow. Athens could outlast the invasions, but at what cost? The farms burning in Attica weren't just crops, they were generations of livelihood turned to ash. And with each passing season, the war's toll became less about territory and more about which society could endure the unendurable. The clash wasn't just between spears and ships, but between two visions of how to win and what winning even meant. For the villagers watching their world burn, the war's grand strategies mattered little. Their suffering was the quiet, unrecorded price of empire. And as Sparta's king finally ordered his army home, the lesson lingered. Some wars aren't won in a single campaign, but in the slow, grinding weight of years. Athens had survived, but the real test was just beginning. The summer heat of 430 BC brought more than just scorching temperatures to Athens. It carried an invisible killer. As Spartan forces camped outside the city walls, something far deadlier slipped through the gates. The plague, likely a form of typhus or typhoid fever, struck with terrifying speed. What began as isolated cases of fever and headaches soon exploded into a full-blown catastrophe. The crowded conditions behind the long walls, meant to protect Athenians from Spartan spears, became the perfect breeding ground for disease. Streets once filled with lively debate and commerce now echoed with the groans of the sick and the wails of mourners. Athens' greatest strength, its dense urban population, suddenly became its fatal weakness. With refugees packed into every available space, the disease spread unchecked. Physicians were powerless. Their remedies of herbs and prayers did nothing against the relentless symptoms. Victims suffered swollen throats, violent coughing fits, and agonizing skin lesions. Some went mad with pain, throwing themselves into wells in desperation. The death toll climbed so quickly that proper burials became impossible. Bodies piled up in temples and streets, left to rot in the open air. The social order collapsed as fear overrode tradition. Families abandoned their sick, and thieves looted the homes of the dead. Pericles, Athens' visionary leader, watched helplessly as the city unraveled. Even his own household wasn't spared. 2 of his sons succumbed to the plague within days of each other. Then, in 429 BC, the disease claimed Pericles himself. His death left a void no successor could fill. The man who had shaped Athens' golden age, who had devised the very strategy of retreating behind the walls, was gone. Without his steady hand, the city's politics fractured into petty squabbles. Opportunists like Cleon, a brash populist, rose to power, trading reasoned debate for fiery demagoguery. Beyond the human cost, the plague reshaped the war itself. Sparta, fearing contagion, withdrew its troops from Attica, a temporary reprieve that came at too high a price. Athens' navy, still dominant at sea, now struggled with depleted crews and dwindling morale. The disease even spread to the fleet, crippling operations at critical moments. Most devastating of all was the psychological blow. Athenians had believed their city was favored by the gods, its walls unbreakable. The plague shattered that illusion, revealing how fragile their greatness truly was. In the years that followed, survivors carried both physical scars and a deeper disillusionment. The epidemic's randomness, sparing some while obliterating entire families, eroded faith in justice or divine order. Thucydides, who lived through the nightmare and recorded its horrors, noted a chilling change in the Athenian character. With death so capricious, he wrote, people began pursuing immediate pleasure, ignoring laws or morals. The plague didn't just kill citizens, it corroded the very ideals Athens had fought to defend. This wasn't merely a tragic interlude in the war, it was a turning point. The balance of power didn't shift because of battles or treaties, but because an unseen microbe exploited the unintended consequences of Pericles' grand strategy. Sparta would return to the field, but Athens would never fully recover, not just in numbers, but in spirit. The plague exposed the cruel irony of war. Sometimes the deadliest enemies aren't the ones you face on the battlefield, but the ones you can't see coming. Pericles' death in 429 BC wasn't just the loss of a leader, it was the unraveling of a carefully crafted vision for Athens' survival. For years, his strategy of retreating behind the long walls had preserved the city's strength while Sparta's invasions burned themselves out. But with his passing, Athens found itself adrift, its political landscape fracturing into competing factions hungry for power. The plague had already shaken the city's confidence. Now, without Pericles' steady guidance, the delicate balance between patience and aggression collapsed. Enter Cleon, a brash, fiery populist who couldn't have been more different from the measured, aristocratic Pericles. Where Pericles had valued deliberation and long-term strategy, Cleon thrived on impulsive action and fiery rhetoric. He dismissed Pericles' defensive approach as cowardice, insisting Athens could only win by striking hard and often. Under his influence, the assembly shifted toward reckless campaigns, chasing quick victories that often ended in disaster. The contrast was stark. Pericles had understood that Athens' power lay in its navy and its ability to outlast Sparta, not in bloody land battles. Cleon, though, mistook desperation for boldness. The consequences were immediate. In 425 BC, Cleon pushed for an audacious attack on Pylos, a rocky outpost in the Peloponnese. Against all odds, it succeeded. Athenian forces captured Spartan hoplites, a humiliation Sparta had never faced. But this fleeting triumph only fueled Cleon's overconfidence. He doubled down, launching ill-advised offensives that stretched Athenian resources thin. The campaign at Amphipolis in 422 BC became a cautionary tale. Cleon's tactical blunders led to his own death and the loss of valuable allies, leaving Athens weaker than before. Beyond the battlefield, Pericles' absence transformed Athenian democracy itself. The dignified debates of the past gave way to shouting matches and demagoguery. Cleon's rise marked the beginning of a darker era where charisma often outweighed wisdom and short-term gains eclipsed long-term stability. Even Thucydides, no fan of Pericles' elitism, lamented the decline, writing that the city's new leaders said what the people wanted to hear, not what they needed to know. The tragedy wasn't just that Athens lost a great statesman, it was that his successors failed to grasp the subtlety of his strategy. Pericles had never intended to hide behind walls forever. He was buying time, waiting for Sparta's alliance to crack under the strain of war. But without his restraint, Athens squandered that time, trading patience for recklessness. The golden age of Athenian leadership had ended, and with it, the best chance for a victory that wouldn't bleed the city dry. Sparta still stood strong, and now Athens faced its greatest challenge, fighting a war without the man who had known how to win it. Pylos should have been a disaster for Athens, an ill-advised gamble by a desperate city still reeling from plague and political chaos. Instead, it became one of the war's most stunning reversals. In 425 BCE, an Athenian fleet under Demosthenes, a general with a knack for unconventional tactics, found itself blown off course near this rocky peninsula in the southwestern Peloponnese. What began as an accident turned into opportunity. Pylos' natural harbor and proximity to Messenia, home to Sparta's restive Helot population, made it a dagger aimed at Sparta's heart. Against all odds, Demosthenes convinced his men to fortify the position, transforming a windswept outpost into an Athenian stronghold right under Sparta's nose. Sparta's reaction was swift and brutal. Their army rushed to dislodge the invaders while their fleet blockaded the harbor, trapping the Athenians, but Demosthenes had prepared for this. His troops, though outnumbered, used the rugged terrain to their advantage, repelling Spartan assaults from the cliffs. Meanwhile, the real turning point unfolded on the tiny island of Sphacteria, just offshore. A contingent of elite Spartan hoplites found themselves stranded there after their ships were destroyed in a surprise Athenian naval attack. For Sparta, this was unthinkable. Their warriors, the pride of Greece, were now trapped like cornered animals. What followed shattered Spartan mythology. Athenian forces, led by Cleon in a rare moment of competence, besieged the island with a relentless barrage of arrows and javelins. The Spartans, trained for close combat, had no answer for this hailstorm of missiles. Exhausted and outmaneuvered, 292 survivors, including 120 full Spartan citizens, surrendered. Greece gasped. These were not just soldiers, they were symbols of Sparta's invincibility, now paraded as prisoners through Athens streets. The psychological impact was seismic. Spartans didn't surrender, they fought to the death or won. Yet here they were, alive and defeated. Athens rejoiced, but the victory came with hidden costs. The success at Pylos emboldened hawks like Cleon to push for riskier campaigns, overextending Athenian resources. Sparta, humiliated but not broken, responded with grim determination. They redoubled efforts to build a navy, vowing never to be outmaneuvered at sea again. Worse still, the captured Spartans became bargaining chips, making Sparta desperate enough to propose peace, but Athens, drunk on triumph, refused. It was a miscalculation that would haunt them. The deeper lesson of Pylos wasn't just about tactics, it was about perception. For centuries, Sparta had cultivated an aura of invulnerability. Now that illusion lay in ruins. Yet Sparta's greatest strength wasn't its reputation, it was its ability to adapt. The same society that prized tradition above all else would soon innovate in ways Athens never anticipated. And while Pylos marked a high point for Athenian morale, it also set the stage for a war that would grow even darker, proving that no single victory could break a foe as resilient as Sparta. The Peace of Nissus in 421 BC was less a true peace and more a collective gasp for air after a decade of exhaustion. Athens, still reeling from the plague and the costly campaigns at Pylos and Amphipolis, had lost its early momentum. Sparta, humiliated by the surrender of its hoplites on Sphacteria and strained by Helot revolts, faced growing dissent among its allies. The terms looked promising on parchment: 50 years of truce, a return of captured territories, and even the symbolic exchange of sworn oaths. Nissus, the Athenian general who brokered the deal, was a cautious man, weary of war's unpredictability. But ink couldn't wash away a decade of spilled blood. What doomed the peace from the start wasn't the treaty itself, but the quiet rebellion simmering beneath it. Corinth and Megara, key Spartan allies, refused to sign, seeing the agreement as a betrayal. Thebes, another powerful city in Sparta's orbit, continued raiding Athenian territories, testing the limits of the truce. Athens, meanwhile, clung to its imperial ambitions, refusing to release all captured cities as promised. Neither side truly disarmed, they merely paused, watching each other through narrowed eyes. The fragility of the peace became clear in the small but telling clashes that followed. In 420 BC, just a year after the treaty's signing, Spartan forces quietly helped the oligarchic faction in the city of Mantinea overthrow its democratic government, an act Athens saw as blatant interference. Then came the scandal at Sion, a rebellious Athenian ally that Sparta had secretly promised to protect. When Athens crushed the revolt anyway, Sparta protested but took no real action, revealing how hollow its commitments had become. Nicias, the peace's namesake, became a tragic figure, a man who believed in diplomacy in an age where power mattered more than promises. His vision of stability crumbled under the weight of mutual suspicion. Even the sacred Olympic truce of 420 BCE, meant to pause all hostilities during the Games, couldn't mask the tension. Athenian and Spartan athletes competed under the same banners while their governments plotted behind closed doors. The so-called peace lasted barely 6 years before collapsing into renewed war, but its failure taught a brutal lesson. Treaties are only as strong as the trust between those who sign them. Without genuine reconciliation, even the most carefully worded agreements become just another battlefield, one where words replace spears, but the stakes remain just as deadly. The Peace of Nicias didn't end the Peloponnesian War. It merely revealed how hard it would be to stop. The tiny island of Milos had no strategic harbors, no mighty fleet, no vast wealth, just a quiet determination to remain neutral in a war that wasn't theirs. But in 416 BC, neutrality was no longer an option. Athens' fleet arrived with a blunt ultimatum: submit and pay tribute or face annihilation. What followed wasn't just a siege. It was a chilling philosophical showdown recorded by Thucydides as the Melian Dialogue, where the brutal calculus of empire collided with the fragile hope of justice. Athens' representatives didn't bother with diplomacy. They laid bare the reality of power. The strong do what they can, they argued, and the weak suffer what they must. To Athens, Milos' independence was an insult, a precedent that other neutral states might follow, weakening their grip on the Aegean. The Melians, though outnumbered, refused to yield. They appealed to honor, to the gods, even to Sparta's distant promise of aid. But Athens dismissed these ideals as fantasies. Justice, they insisted, only exists between equals. The rest is merely survival. The siege dragged on for months. Milos' walls held, but hunger and betrayal eroded their resolve. When the city finally fell, Athens showed no mercy. Every man of military age was executed. Women and children were sold into slavery. The island was repopulated with Athenian settlers, its history erased with a single, brutal stroke. The message to the Greek world was clear: neutrality was a luxury and resistance was suicide. Yet the true horror of Milos wasn't just the slaughter, it was the cold rationality behind it. Athens didn't act in blind rage. They made a calculated decision to terrorize potential rivals. The Melian Dialogue became a timeless study in realpolitik, where morality crumbled before the demands of power. Even more haunting was the irony. Athens, the birthplace of democracy, now wielded the same ruthless tactics it once despised in Persian tyrants. For modern readers, the tragedy echoes far beyond ancient Greece. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the price of security, the limits of idealism, and how easily noble societies can justify atrocity when survival is at stake. Milos wasn't just a victim of Athenian aggression, it was a mirror held up to the darkest corners of human nature, and as Athens would soon discover, the lessons of power cut both ways. The same ruthlessness that silenced Milos would eventually fuel the reckoning awaiting them on distant shores. The Sicilian expedition began not with a whisper of caution, but with a roar of ambition. In 415 BC, Athens, flush with confidence after years of war, set its sights on Sicily, a land of untapped riches and strategic potential. The island's powerful city-state, Syracuse, was a Dorian ally of Sparta, and conquering it would cripple their rivals' influence while securing vast resources for Athens. The assembly, swayed by the fiery rhetoric of Alcibiades, voted to send a colossal armada, 134 triremes, over 5,000 hoplites, and a fleet of support ships. It was the largest military force Athens had ever assembled, a testament to their belief in destiny. But from the outset, the expedition was haunted by fatal flaws. Alcibiades, the charismatic architect of the campaign, was a man of brilliance and reckless ambition. Just as the fleet prepared to sail, a shocking scandal erupted. Statues of Hermes throughout Athens were mutilated in a single night, an act of sacrilege that sent the city into panic. Alcibiades, already distrusted for his aristocratic excesses, was accused of orchestrating the desecration. Rather than delay the mission to address the charges, Athens made a catastrophic decision. They let him lead the fleet anyway, only to recall him for trial mid-voyage. Facing almost certain execution, Alcibiades did the unthinkable. He defected to Sparta. In one stroke, Athens lost its most cunning general and handed its enemy intimate knowledge of their plans. Command fell to Nicias, a cautious and ailing general who had opposed the expedition from the start. His co-commander, Lamachus, was a capable soldier but lacked the strategic vision to compensate for Nicias' hesitation. The divided leadership proved disastrous. Instead of striking Syracuse swiftly, the Athenians wasted precious months skirmishing in the Sicilian countryside, giving the Syracusans time to fortify and rally allies. By the time Athens finally besieged the city, Sparta had heeded Alcibiades' advice and sent reinforcements, including the general Gylippus, who galvanized Syracuse's defenses. The tide turned with brutal speed. Athenian ships trapped in Syracuse's great harbor were outmaneuvered by enemy vessels reinforced with Spartan tactics. On land, Gylippus' forces broke the siege, driving the Athenians into retreat. What followed was a nightmare. Thousands of soldiers, starving and diseased, stumbled through hostile terrain, harried by Sicilian cavalry. Nicias, despite his illness, urged his men onward, but hope vanished when the Syracusans cornered them at the Acinarus River. In a frenzy of thirst and despair, Athenians trampled one another to reach the water, only to be slaughtered or captured. The survivors faced a fate worse than death: enslavement in Sicilian quarries, where they perished from exposure and starvation. The scale of the loss was unimaginable. Of the 40,000 Athenians and allies who sailed to Sicily, barely a handful returned. The treasury lay drained, the navy decimated, and the city's spirit shattered. But the true cost was deeper than numbers. The Sicilian expedition exposed the fatal cracks in Athenian democracy, the fickleness of the assembly, the peril of charismatic but unreliable leaders, and the hubris of overreach. Syracuse became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the mightiest empires can crumble when ambition outpaces wisdom. For Sparta, the victory was a turning point. For Athens, it was the beginning of the end. The war would drag on for another decade, but after Sicily, the outcome seemed inevitable. The expedition's legacy wasn't just a military defeat. It was the moment Athens lost its claim to invincibility, and with it, the war. The plains of Mantinea in 418 BC became the stage for Sparta's defiant answer to doubters. After years of setbacks trapped hoplites at Pylos, a shaky peace with Athens, and whispers of Spartan decline, their king Augeas II led a force to crush the rising power of Argos, Athens' ally in the Peloponnese. This wasn't just another skirmish, it was Sparta's chance to prove their legendary army still ruled the land. What unfolded was a masterclass in discipline and brute force, a battle that would silence critics and reshape the war's momentum. Argos and its coalition, bolstered by Athenian troops, entered the field with confidence. Their numbers were strong, their strategy sound, or so they thought. But Sparta's phalanx moved like a single organism, its ranks tight, its advance relentless. When Augeas noticed his left flank drifting too far forward, he issued a last-minute adjustment, a risky maneuver that could have spelled disaster. Yet Spartan training turned potential chaos into precision. The right wing held firm as the left recalibrated, closing the gap just as the Argives charged. What followed was carnage. Argos' lines shattered under the weight of Spartan spears, their allies scattering in panic. Athenian forces caught in the rout barely escaped annihilation. By day's end, the field belonged to Sparta, its reputation as Greece's unbeatable land power restored. The victory's ripple effects were immediate. Cities wavering between Athens and Sparta suddenly remembered where true strength lay. Argos, humiliated, abandoned its democratic faction and realigned with Spartan oligarchs. Most crucially, Athens received a stark warning. Their naval supremacy meant little if Sparta could dominate the Peloponnese unchecked. The battle also exposed a tactical truth: Sparta's rigid discipline could adapt when needed. Augeas' mid-battle adjustment showed flexibility behind the famed Spartan stubbornness, a hint that even tradition-bound Sparta could innovate under pressure. Yet the triumph came with shadows. The sheer bloodshed over 1,000 Argives and allies' dead-hardened regional divisions. Sparta's allies, while impressed, grew uneasy at the brutality. And Athens, though shaken, wasn't broken. Instead of cowering, they doubled down on naval raids, probing Sparta's coastal weaknesses. Mantinea became a paradox, a victory so decisive it reminded everyone why the war was far from over. Sparta had won the day, but the cost of maintaining that dominance would only grow steeper. The battle didn't end the Peloponnesian War, it set the stage for its next, even darker chapter. Athens in 411 BC was a city tearing itself apart from within. The disastrous Sicilian expedition had shattered morale, drained the treasury, and left the democracy vulnerable to its critics. Into this void stepped a faction of oligarchs, wealthy elites who had long resented the power of the common citizens. Their argument was seductive in its simplicity. Democracy had failed, and only a strong, disciplined government could save Athens from collapse. What began as whispered discontent soon became a full-blown conspiracy, orchestrated by shadowy clubs known as the Heterii, where aristocrats plotted over wine and rhetoric. The coup unfolded with chilling efficiency. Key democratic leaders were assassinated, while the assembly, cowed by threats and manipulated by fear, voted to abolish itself. Power was handed to a council of 400 oligarchs who promised to rule with the wisdom Athens so desperately needed. But behind the noble rhetoric lay a brutal reality. Dissenters were purged, free speech silenced, and the navy, traditionally the backbone of Athenian democracy, found its rowers, many of them poor citizens, stripped of influence overnight. Yet the oligarchy's grip was as fragile as it was ferocious. The very navy they marginalized became their undoing. Athenian sailors stationed at Samos, furious at being excluded from the new order, declared their loyalty not to the oligarchs but to the exiled Alcibiades, whose military genius they hoped could salvage the war. This rebellion at sea exposed the regime's fatal weakness. It had no broad base of support. Within months, infighting among the oligarchs and rising unrest in the streets forced their collapse. Democracy was restored, but the damage lingered. The coup's true cost wasn't just political, it was strategic. While Athens descended into chaos, Sparta seized the moment, tightening its naval alliances and pressuring vulnerable Athenian holdings. The oligarchs' brief reign had fractured trust within the city, making coordinated resistance harder. Even after democracy returned, the scars remained. Citizens who had once stood united now eyed each other with suspicion, and the once unshakable faith in Athenian institutions had cracked. This wasn't just a power struggle, it was a warning. The coup revealed how quickly fear and ambition could unravel even the most storied democracy. And for Sparta, watching from across the Aegean, it confirmed a crucial truth. Athens' greatest enemy wasn't just Sparta's armies, it was the divisions within its own walls. The oligarchs had hoped to save Athens by destroying its democracy. Instead, they handed Sparta an advantage no battlefield could match: the gift of a divided foe. The waters off Cyzicus in 410 BC became the stage for one of the most audacious naval maneuvers of the entire war. Athenian commander Alcibiades, freshly returned from exile, joined forces with generals Thrasybulus and the Rhamnes to execute a plan so bold even Sparta's seasoned admirals never saw it coming. Under cover of stormy weather, the Athenian fleet split into 3 divisions, one to lure the Spartan ships into open water, while the others closed in from hidden positions. The trap was sprung with devastating precision. Spartan vessels caught between converging Athenian triremes found themselves rammed, boarded, and set ablaze. By day's end, the entire Peloponnesian fleet lay destroyed or captured, their admiral Mindarus dead, his last message to Sparta famously intercepted: ships gone. Mindarus dead, men starving, know not what to do. For Athens, the victory was more than tactical, it was psychological. After the nightmare of Sicily and the chaos of the oligarchic coup, Cyzicus proved the city still had fight left. Streets that had echoed with despair now buzzed with renewed hope. Alcibiades, once branded a traitor, became the hero of the hour, his name chanted in the assembly. The win reopened vital Black Sea grain routes, easing food shortages that had plagued the city. Even Sparta, so confident after years of grinding Athens down, hesitated. Peace feelers emerged, testing whether the balance had shifted, but triumph at sea masked deeper cracks. The battle had stretched Athenian resources to their limits. Skilled rowers, once the backbone of the navy, were now scarce, replaced by inexperienced recruits hastily pressed into service. The treasury, drained by decades of war, couldn't sustain another grand fleet like the one lost in Sicily. And while Cyzicus secured the Aegean temporarily, Sparta was already adapting. With Persian gold flowing into their coffers, they began rebuilding their navy faster than Athens could replace its veterans. Most critically, the victory couldn't heal Athens' political divisions. Alcibiades' resurgence alienated rivals who still distrusted his ambition. The democratic factions, though victorious over the oligarchs, remained fractured by infighting. Cyzicus became a flicker of light in a gathering storm, a reminder of what Athens could achieve at its best, but also of how far it had fallen from its imperial peak. The war's tide had turned before, only to recede again. This time, the cost of turning it back would be higher than anyone imagined. The battle's legacy wasn't in the ships sunk or the territories reclaimed, but in the cruel irony it exposed. Even the most dazzling victory means little when the foundations beneath it are crumbling. Athens had won the day at Cyzicus, but the war was far from over, and the next defeat would leave no room for comebacks. Alcibiades sailed back to Athens in 407 BC like a storm rolling in from the sea, unpredictable, electrifying, impossible to ignore. The city that had once condemned him to death now welcomed him with open arms, desperate for the kind of military genius only he could provide. Streets that had echoed with curses now rang with cheers as he paraded through the gates, his golden charisma undimmed by years of exile. Athens was on the ropes. Sparta's rebuilt navy, funded by Persian gold, threatened their lifelines, and in that moment of crisis, the prodigal son became their last, best hope. His return wasn't just a political spectacle, it was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Sparta had spent years fearing his influence, and now here he was, back in command of the fleet that had triumphed at Cyzicus. Almost immediately, he delivered results. Leading a revitalized Athenian navy, he outmaneuvered Spartan forces near the Hellespont, securing critical grain shipments and rallying demoralized allies. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the tide might turn, that Athens could claw its way back from the brink. Crowds in the Pnyx whispered that the gods had sent Alcibiades to save them, his very presence restoring a swagger the city hadn't felt since before Sicily. But brilliance often walks hand in hand with recklessness. Alcibiades' command style, bold to the point of arrogance, began to fray the trust of his officers. When he left the fleet under a subordinate's care to personally lobby for more funds in Athens, disaster struck. His stand-in, ignoring explicit orders, engaged the Spartans near Notium and lost. The defeat was more than tactical. It shattered the aura of invincibility Alcibiades had carefully rebuilt. Critics pounced, accusing him of prioritizing personal glory over discipline. Even his supporters wavered, questioning whether the man who had betrayed Athens once might do so again. The assembly's verdict was swift and brutal. Alcibiades, the savior of the hour just months before, was stripped of command. This time, there would be no triumphant return. He fled to a fortified estate in Thrace, watching from afar as Athens spiraled toward its doom. His downfall mirrored the war itself, a series of soaring highs and crushing lows, where talent alone couldn't outrun the weight of mistrust. In the end, Alcibiades' greatest flaw wasn't his ambition or even his betrayals. It was his inability to see that no single man, no matter how gifted, could control the chaos he helped unleash. What lingers about his story isn't just the battles won or lost, but the haunting question of what might have been. Had Athens fully embraced his leadership, could they have outlasted Sparta? Or was his tumultuous career proof that the war had grown too vast, too destructive for any one person to steer? Alcibiades didn't just fight for Athens or Sparta, he fought for himself, a trait that made him dazzling and doomed in equal measure. His exile marked more than the end of a general. It was the closing of a chapter where charisma could still shape destiny. The war's final acts would belong to men of lesser flair but greater ruthlessness, and Athens would pay the price for that shift. The waters near Notium in 406 BC should have been safe territory for Athens' familiar seas where their vaunted navy had dominated for decades. But when the Athenian fleet, now under the command of Alcibiades' inexperienced subordinate Antiochus, grew restless waiting for their absent leader, they made a fatal mistake. Against explicit orders, Antiochus provoked a skirmish with the Spartan fleet led by the cunning Lysander. It wasn't supposed to be a full engagement, just a taunting feint to test Spartan resolve. Yet what began as a reckless gamble spiraled into catastrophe. Lysander, a commander who had spent years studying Athenian tactics, pounced with lethal precision. His ships sliced through the disorganized Athenian lines, sinking vessels and sending survivors fleeing in disarray. By the time the smoke cleared, Athens had lost over 20 triremes, not just ships, but irreplaceable crews and the last shreds of their naval invincibility. This wasn't merely a lost battle, it was a revelation. For the first time, Sparta had outmaneuvered Athens at sea, not through brute force, but through superior strategy. Lysander's victory exposed a chilling truth Athens' edge had dulled. Their once unmatched sailors were now green recruits, their tactics predictable, their leadership fractured. The defeat at Notium ripped away the illusion that Athenian naval dominance was unshakable. Worse still, it handed Sparta something far more valuable than sunken ships: confidence. If Lysander could humiliate Athens here, he could do it anywhere. The fallout was immediate and personal. Alcibiades, already skating on thin ice after years of exile and mistrust, bore the brunt of the blame. Though he hadn't even been present at the battle, his decision to leave the fleet in untested hands was seen as unforgivable negligence. The assembly, so quick to celebrate him months earlier, now turned its back. Stripped of command for the final time, Alcibiades fled into permanent exile, his star extinguished just as Athens needed him most. His dismissal wasn't just the end of a career, it was the loss of the one commander who might have salvaged the war. Beyond the political drama, Notium marked a strategic tipping point. Sparta, once a land power struggling to match Athens at sea, now had a blueprint for victory. Lysander's innovative tactics targeting supply lines, exploiting hesitation, and leveraging Persian gold to rebuild faster than Athens could recover became the new normal. Meanwhile, Athens' resources dwindled, its allies wavered, and its once proud navy could no longer guarantee safety. The balance of power hadn't just shifted, it had cracked. The true cost of Notium wasn't measured in lost ships but in lost time. Every trireme sunk was one Athens couldn't replace quickly enough. Every seasoned rower lost was a gap that couldn't be filled. And every month Sparta grew stronger was another step toward the unthinkable, a world where Athenian sails no longer ruled the waves. The battle itself was small, but its implications were vast, a preview of the final, devastating act still to come. The Battle of Arginusi in 406 BC should have been a moment of triumph for Athens, a desperate, against all odds victory that proved their navy still had fight left. Instead, it became a tragedy of errors where victory at sea was overshadowed by chaos on land. Facing a revitalized Spartan fleet under Callicratidas, Athens scraped together every available ship, even stripping gold from statues to fund new triremes. The result was a ragtag armada of untested crews and last-minute reinforcements, thrust into battle near the small islands of Arginusi. What followed was one of the war's most dramatic naval clashes. Athens' innovative tactics, dividing their fleet into agile squadrons, outmaneuvered Sparta's traditional formation. Waves battered both sides as oars snapped and hulls splintered, but when the storm of battle cleared, Athens stood victorious. 70 Spartan ships lay sunk or captured, their admiral dead, while Athens lost just 25 vessels. On paper, it was a stunning turnaround, proof that even in its twilight, Athenian naval brilliance could still shine. Yet the real drama unfolded after the battle. A violent storm rolled in, preventing Athenian commanders from rescuing survivors clinging to wreckage. Thousands of rowers and soldiers, many of them Athenian citizens, drowned in the churning waters while their generals hesitated, fearing the storm would claim more ships. When news reached Athens, the city erupted in outrage. The assembly, fueled by grief and political opportunists, demanded scapegoats. 6 of the victorious generals were arrested, charged with negligence, and condemned in a single reckless trial. Even Socrates, serving on the council that day, protested the unjust haste, but his voice was drowned out by the mob's thirst for vengeance. The generals were executed, their expertise lost at the very moment Athens needed it most. The fallout was catastrophic. Not only had Athens sacrificed skilled leaders, but the trial exposed the rot at the heart of its democracy, where emotion and demagogues could override justice and reason. Sailors and soldiers, once proud to serve, now questioned whether their lives would be valued in victory or defeat. Morale plummeted just as Sparta, under the ruthless Lysander, was regrouping. The bitter irony was inescapable. Athens had won the battle but crippled itself in the aftermath. Arginusi became a cautionary tale of how political infighting could turn military success into strategic disaster, a lesson that would haunt Athens in the war's final, devastating chapters. The victory had bought them time, but at a cost they could ill afford: their own unity. The winter of 405 BC settled over Athens like a shroud, the bite of hunger sharper than the cold. Sparta's grip tightened relentlessly, their land forces camped outside the long walls, their navy, now bolstered by Persian gold, choking off the last grain routes from the Black Sea. Inside the city, desperation festered. The once bustling agora stood eerily quiet, its stalls empty. Families rationed moldy barley, boiled leather for broth, and scavenged for scraps in streets where stray cats had long since vanished. The proud democracy that had defied Persia and built an empire now watched its children wither, their ribs pressing against thin skin. For the first time in generations, Athens faced the unthinkable: surrender. Lysander, Sparta's cunning naval commander, understood the power of patience. His blockade wasn't just a military tactic, it was psychological warfare. Each day without food eroded Athenian resolve, each empty harbor a reminder of their fading dominance. When a desperate Athenian envoy finally rode out to negotiate, Lysander's terms were brutal: dismantle the long walls, surrender all but 12 ships, and submit to Spartan rule. The envoy returned hollow-eyed, bearing the weight of humiliation. Yet even as factional debates raged, some urging defiance to the bitter end, others pleading for mercy, the truth was inescapable. The treasury was empty, the granaries bare, the people broken. The final act played out in the shadow of the Acropolis. In April 404 BC, Athens capitulated. The terms were enforced with Spartan efficiency. The iconic long walls, symbols of Athenian resilience, were torn down to the sound of flutes, as if celebrating their destruction. Sparta's allies, particularly Corinth and Thebes, demanded harsher justice. They wanted Athens erased, its people enslaved as they had enslaved others. But Sparta, wary of upsetting the balance of power, spared the city total annihilation. The message was clear: Athens would live, but only as a shadow of itself. What made this moment so devastating wasn't just the military defeat, but the death of an idea. For decades, Athens had been more than a city. It was a beacon of democracy, art, and ambition. Now its streets echoed with the footsteps of Spartan overseers, its assembly silenced, its ships reduced to a token fleet. The war hadn't just ended an empire, it had extinguished a golden age. Yet even in surrender, Athens' legacy refused to vanish entirely. The embers of its culture, though dampened, would smolder, waiting for a future where freedom could reignite them. The siege had broken a city, but not its spirit. That, as history would prove, was harder to kill. The Hellespont in 405 BC seemed an unlikely place for history to pivot, a narrow strait where the waters of the Aegean met the Black Sea, far from Athens' marble temples or Sparta's barracks. Yet it was here, at Aegospotami, that the Peloponnesian War reached its brutal climax. Athens' remaining fleet, though battered, still posed a threat until Lysander, Sparta's master tactician, turned routine into ruin. For days he watched as Athenian triremes rowed out each morning, formed battle lines, then retreated to shore when no engagement came. It was a dance of exhaustion, a test of discipline. And Lysander, patient as a spider, waited for the misstep that would end the war. That moment came on the 5th day. As the Athenians beached their ships and scattered in search of food, Lysander's fleet, hidden just out of sight, surged forward with oars at full speed. The attack was so sudden, so perfectly timed, that most Athenian crews never had a chance to arm themselves. Spartans swarmed the undefended vessels, torching hulls and slaughtering sailors where they stood. Within hours, nearly the entire Athenian navy, 180 triremes, was captured or destroyed. Only a handful escaped, racing westward to carry news of the catastrophe. The scale of the loss was incomprehensible. Athens' lifeline, the fleet that had fed its people and defended its empire for decades, now lay in ashes. The aftermath was even more chilling. Lysander, showing a ruthlessness that would define his legacy, ordered the execution of 3,000 Athenian prisoners. Their bodies lined the shore, a grim warning to any who still dared resist. For Sparta, Aegospotami wasn't just a victory, it was vengeance. Every sunken ship repaid the humiliation of Pylos. Every dead sailor answered the decades of Athenian arrogance. Yet the true masterstroke wasn't the battle itself, but what came next. Rather than marching directly on Athens, Lysander methodically severed its remaining allies, choking off grain supplies and isolating the city until starvation did his work for him. Athens, when the news arrived, descended into collective shock. The assembly, once a forum of bold debate, now echoed with hollow silence. Without a navy, the city was defenseless. No way to import food, no means to rally allies, no hope of breaking Sparta's stranglehold. The long walls, those towering symbols of Athenian resilience, became useless stone. For the first time since the Persian Wars, the unthinkable was whispered in the agora: surrender. Aegospotami hadn't just destroyed ships, it had shattered the illusion that Athens could endure forever. The war's final act had begun, and this time there would be no last-minute reversals, no Alcibiades to ride in and save the day. Only the slow, inevitable crush of defeat. What makes this battle so haunting isn't just its military significance, but the way it exposes the fragility of power. Athens at its height had been a colossus, its navy unmatched, its culture radiant, its influence stretching across the Aegean. Yet in the end, it took just one afternoon of misjudgment to undo it all. Aegospotami stands as a lesson in how quickly dominance can unravel when discipline wavers and adversaries adapt. Sparta, once the underdog at sea, had learned its enemies' tricks too well. And Athens, for all its brilliance, had forgotten the oldest rule of war: no empire is invincible. The triremes burning at Aegospotami weren't just ships, they were the dying embers of an era. Athens in 404 BC was a city stripped bare not just of its walls, but of its very identity. The terms of surrender were as humiliating as they were absolute. Spartan soldiers, under the watchful eye of Lysander, oversaw the dismantling of the long walls, those towering symbols of Athenian defiance that had once shielded the city from Persia and Sparta alike. Crowds gathered in stunned silence as the stones that had safeguarded their democracy for generations were pried apart to the mocking tune of Spartan flutes, a deliberate insult dressed as celebration. But the physical destruction paled next to the political gutting that followed. Sparta installed a puppet government, the 30 tyrants, a brutal oligarchy handpicked to ensure Athens would never rise again. The 30 moved swiftly to erase decades of democratic tradition. They purged the courts, disbanded the assembly, and filled prisons with political opponents. For 8 months, Athens lived under a reign of terror where summary executions became routine and property seizures enriched the oligarchs. The Rhaemenes, one of the 30's own members, dared to criticize their excesses only to be forced to drink hemlock, a grim echo of Socrates' fate years later. The message was clear: dissent, even from within, would not be tolerated. Yet in the shadows, resistance simmered. Exiled Democrats, led by Thrasybulus, regrouped in the borderland stronghold of Phyle. Their ranks swelled with everyday Athenians, farmers, craftsmen, even former slaves who refused to accept the death of their democracy. In a daring nighttime raid, they seized the Piraeus, Athens' vital port, turning its narrow streets into a battleground. The 30, desperate to crush the rebellion, called for Spartan aid, but even Lysander's forces couldn't stem the tide. The oligarch's cruelty had backfired, uniting Athenians across class lines against them. The tide turned at the Battle of Mantinea, where Thrasybulus' outnumbered rebels exploited the rugged terrain to rout the 30's forces. Among the dead was Chryses, the oligarchy's most ruthless enforcer. His demise met with quiet relief even by some of his former allies. With their grip slipping, the surviving tyrants fled to Eleusis, leaving Athens to negotiate an improbable reconciliation. What followed was a testament to the resilience of Athenian ideals, a general amnesty forbidding retribution for crimes committed during the oligarchy. It wasn't forgiveness, the wounds ran too deep for that, but a pragmatic vow to prioritize unity over vengeance. By 403 BC, democracy was restored, fragile but unbroken. The 30's brief reign had exposed both the fragility of freedom and its stubborn persistence. Sparta, focused on quelling unrest elsewhere, grudgingly accepted the new reality. Athens would never reclaim its empire, but something more essential had survived: the belief that citizens, not tyrants, should steer their fate. The Peloponnesian War had ended with Sparta's victory, yet the deeper struggle between oppression and self-rule was far from decided. In the ashes of defeat, Athens had rediscovered its founding spirit, proving that some ideas cannot be dismantled stone by stone. The fall of the 30 tyrants in 403 BC wasn't just a political upheaval, it was a testament to the stubborn resilience of an idea. For 8 brutal months, Athens had endured the oligarchy's reign of terror, its streets patrolled by Spartan-backed enforcers, its democracy dismantled piece by piece. Yet even as the 30 seized property, silenced dissent, and filled mass graves with their opponents, they underestimated the quiet fury brewing beyond the city walls. The exiles who regrouped at Phyle weren't an army of seasoned generals or wealthy elites. They were cobblers, farmers, and disgraced soldiers, united by a shared refusal to let their city's light be snuffed out. When Thrasybulus led 70 men through a snowstorm to retake the fortress, it wasn't just a tactical strike. It was the first spark of a rebellion that would burn far brighter than Sparta ever anticipated. What followed was a masterclass in grassroots defiance. The rebels' ranks swelled daily as Athenians of all classes flocked to their banner, not just for idealism but for survival. The 30's confiscations and executions had turned even moderate citizens against them, proving that oppression often sows the seeds of its own destruction. By the time Thrasybulus' forces seized Piraeus, Athens' vital port, the oligarchs were trapped in a paradox of their own making. Their brutality had backfired, uniting rich and poor against them in ways the democracy never could. The Battle of Mantinea became the tipping point, where the rebels' clever use of terrain turned the narrow streets into a death trap for the tyrants' armored hoplites. When Chryses, the regime's most vicious enforcer, fell in the fighting, even some of his allies breathed sighs of relief. The real miracle, though, came after the fighting stopped. As the remaining oligarchs fled to Eleusis, Athens faced a choice: vengeance or renewal. The answer was the amnesty decree of 403 BC, a radical pact to forbid retribution for crimes committed during the tyranny. This wasn't forgiveness, it was pragmatism of the highest order. Athenians understood that to rebuild, they had to prioritize unity over justice, even for atrocities that still stung. The reconciliation that followed wasn't perfect. Distrust lingered for generations, but it allowed democracy to take root again without drowning in blood feuds. This chapter reveals a truth far greater than Sparta's military victory. Empires can be toppled, but ideas are harder to kill. Athens' democracy had survived not just Spartan spears, but its own darkest betrayals. The restored system would never reclaim its imperial glory, yet something more profound emerged, a recognition that freedom, once tasted, becomes a hunger people will fight to reclaim. The 30s downfall wasn't just the end of a regime. It was proof that even in defeat, Athens refused to vanish quietly into history's shadows. The war had ended, but the spirit it forged would echo through centuries, reminding us that the most enduring victories aren't always won on battlefields, but in the hearts of those who refuse to kneel. The Peloponnesian War didn't just end with Sparta's victory, it shattered the very fabric of Greek civilization. For nearly 3 decades, Athens and Sparta had bled each other dry, their allies pulled into a vortex of sieges, betrayals, and shifting allegiances. By the time the dust settled, the once proud city-states stood hollowed out, their treasuries empty, their populations decimated, and their trust in each other irreparably broken. The war's true cost wasn't just measured in ruined walls or sunken triremes, but in the collective exhaustion that left Greece vulnerable to a new threat rising in the north, the Kingdom of Macedon. Philip II, a shrewd and ambitious ruler, watched the chaos unfold with calculating eyes. He recognized what the Greeks had failed to grasp, that their endless infighting had made them weak. While Sparta struggled to maintain its shaky hegemony and Athens limped toward a shadow of its former self, Philip unified Macedon's fractious tribes, modernized its army, and bided his time. The Peloponnesian War had taught him everything he needed to know about Greek division. When he finally marched south in the mid-4th century BC, the exhausted city-states could barely muster a unified defense. At the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, Philip's forces crushed the combined armies of Athens and Thebes, marking the end of an era. The independent Greek polis, the very heartbeat of classical civilization, would never again wield the power it once had. But the war's legacy wasn't just geopolitical, it was philosophical. Thucydides, the historian who chronicled the conflict, saw it as a cautionary tale about the corrosive nature of unchecked ambition and the fragility of democracy under strain. The same Athens that had championed free speech and rational debate descended into mob rule during the Arginusi trial, then collapsed into oligarchy under the 30 tyrants. Sparta, for all its discipline, proved just as susceptible to arrogance, overextending itself until its victory became a hollow burden. These weren't just ancient missteps, they were timeless warnings about how power, when left unbalanced, consumes even those who wield it. Perhaps the most haunting lesson was how quickly prosperity could unravel. Greece's golden age, with its unparalleled achievements in art, philosophy, and governance, had seemed unshakable until it wasn't. The war exposed the precariousness of civilization itself, reminding us that no society, no matter how brilliant, is immune to self-destruction. When Alexander, Philip's son, embarked on his conquests, he carried Greek culture to the ends of the known world, but the heart of that culture, the vibrant, contentious world of independent city-states, was already a relic. The Peloponnesian War hadn't just changed the balance of power, it had rewritten the rules of history, proving that the greatest threats often come not from external enemies, but from within. Athens and Sparta weren't just rival cities, they were mirror opposites, each reflecting a radically different vision of what a society should be. Athens, a bustling port city with its harbors teeming with merchants and philosophers, thrived on openness and innovation. Its navy, the most advanced in the Greek world, wasn't just a military force. It was the lifeblood of an empire built on trade, diplomacy, and the free exchange of ideas. The same ships that patrolled the Aegean also carried olive oil to Egypt, silver to Persia, and plays by Sophocles to eager audiences across the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, in the assembly, citizens debated everything from war strategy to street repairs, their voices shaping the world's first democracy. This was a city that celebrated the individual, where a potter's son could rise to lead the assembly, and a playwright's words could sway public opinion as powerfully as any general's sword. Sparta, by contrast, moved to the rhythm of the barracks, not the marketplace. From the moment a child took their first breath, the state decided their fate. Healthy infants were trained for war, while the weak were left to perish. There were no grand theaters in Sparta, no sprawling marketplaces buzzing with foreign tongues. Instead, the Aegoge, Sparta's brutal training system, molded boys into warriors who could endure hunger, pain, and freezing temperatures without complaint. Wealth was scorned, luxury forbidden, and even speech was clipped into terse phrases. Spartans were so economical with words that laconic became their legacy. Their army, a machine of synchronized shields and spears, moved with a discipline that made other Greeks tremble. While Athens dazzled with its art and rhetoric, Sparta awed with its sheer, unbreakable cohesion. The ideological gulf between them ran even deeper than their military tactics. Athens believed in the power of the collective mind, that progress came from debate, experimentation, and the clash of perspectives. Sparta saw such openness as dangerous, a threat to the rigid hierarchy that kept their society stable. Where Athenian youth studied poetry and music, Spartan boys learned to steal silently, proving their cunning. Where Athenian women could own property and engage in intellectual life, Spartan women were valued primarily for bearing strong sons, yet even they enjoyed freedoms unheard of elsewhere, training in athletics to ensure hardy offspring. These weren't just cultural quirks, they were fundamentally incompatible ways of life. This clash of values made their war inevitable. Athens' expansion threatened Sparta's carefully balanced system, where Helot slaves outnumbered citizens 20-1. The mere existence of Athenian democracy, with its message of empowerment, risked inspiring rebellions in Sparta's oppressed underclass. Conversely, Sparta's militarized society represented everything Athens feared, a world where individuality was crushed beneath the boot of tradition. When they finally collided, it wasn't just a fight for territory, but for the soul of Greece itself. The war's twists from Athens' plague fueled desperation to Sparta's eventual naval adaptation, all stemmed from this core tension. Athens' creativity gave it resilience, but also recklessness. Sparta's discipline made it relentless, but resistant to change. In the end, their greatest strengths became their fatal flaws, proving that no ideology, no matter how brilliant or brutal, could claim perfection. Their struggle wasn't just history, it was a timeless lesson about the price of extremes. Pericles stood atop Athens' walls, gazing at the distant smoke of Spartan fires, his mind already calculating the next move. More than any politician or general, his vision defined the war's early years. With his stirring funeral orations and unshakable belief in Athenian resilience, he convinced a city built on debate to embrace a radical strategy, abandon the countryside, retreat behind the long walls, and let Sparta's invasions crash against their naval supremacy. His genius wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. He understood that Athens' true strength lay not in its soil, but in its people's willingness to endure. Yet even Pericles couldn't foresee the plague that would ravage the overcrowded city. nor how his own death in 429 BC would leave Athens adrift, its moral compass shattered just when steady leadership mattered most. Contrast him with Alcibiades, the war's most dazzling and destructive figure, a man who switched sides twice yet remained indispensable to both. Charismatic to the point of hypnotic, he convinced Athens to gamble everything on the Sicilian expedition, then defected to Sparta when political winds turned against him. There he whispered secrets that doomed his former home, only to resurface as an Athenian admiral after Sparta tired of his intrigues. His naval victories at Cyzicus and Abydos briefly revived Athenian hopes, but his fatal flaw, an inability to inspire trust, ultimately undid him. The same brilliance that outmaneuvered fleets couldn't outrun the consequences of his betrayals. Alcibiades wasn't just a commander, he was a force of nature, proving that in war, talent without loyalty can be as dangerous as incompetence. On the Spartan side, few matched the cunning of Brasidas, the rogue general who turned the tide in the north. While Sparta's kings hesitated, he marched an army of freed helots and mercenaries through hostile territory, capturing Athenian allies with a mix of diplomacy and daring. His victory at Amphipolis in 422 BC cost Athens a vital silver mine and the life of Cleon, its firebrand leader. But Brasidas' death in that same battle revealed Sparta's deeper weakness, its reliance on individual genius to compensate for institutional rigidity. Without him, their northern campaign crumbled. Then there was Lysander, the admiral who broke Athens' spirit. Unlike traditional Spartan leaders, he mastered naval warfare, leveraging Persian gold to build a fleet that could finally outmatch Athens. His triumph at Aegospotami wasn't just a battle won, it was a city starved into surrender. Yet his post-war arrogance, installing puppet dictators across Greece, proved Sparta's victory couldn't sustain peace. The very ruthlessness that won the war sowed the seeds of Sparta's eventual decline. These figures weren't just players in a conflict, they were embodiments of their city's souls. Pericles' eloquent democracy, Alcibiades' restless ambition, Brasidas' unconventional audacity, Lysander's disciplined brutality, each reflected the systems that shaped them. Their triumphs and failures remind us that war isn't just about armies and alliances, but the humans who steer them, for better or worse. The Peloponnesian War's greatest tragedy may be how often the right leader emerged at the wrong moment, or how brilliance alone couldn't mend the fractures of a Greece tearing itself apart. The fate of empires often hinges not on towering walls or vast armies, but on the silent dance of wooden hulls across open water. For Athens, the trireme was more than a warship. It was the beating heart of its power, a technological marvel that turned the Aegean into an Athenian highway. These sleek vessels, powered by 170 rowers arranged in 3 tiers, could reach speeds unmatched by any contemporary navy, their bronze rams capable of splintering enemy hulls with surgical precision. Athenian dominance at sea wasn't just about numbers, it was a culture of innovation. Rowers trained relentlessly, their synchronized strokes honed to execute complex maneuvers like the Deiplis, a daring breakthrough tactic where triremes sliced through enemy lines before wheeling to strike from behind. Naval battles became chess matches of momentum and angles, where superior skill could overcome numerical odds. Sparta's early attempts to challenge this supremacy bordered on tragicomedy. Landlocked by tradition, their first fleets floundered like bulls in a china shop, heavy, slow, and no match for Athenian agility. The disaster at Pylos in 425 BC laid bare their weakness. Even Sparta's finest hoplites were helpless when trapped on an island by Athenian ships. Yet Sparta's eventual naval adaptation became one of the war's most unexpected twists. Persian gold financed new fleets, while defectors like Alcibiades provided insider knowledge of Athenian tactics. By the war's final decade, Sparta under the ruthless Lysander had mastered the art of asymmetrical warfare at sea. They avoided head-to-head clashes, instead strangling Athenian supply lines and striking where the navy was stretched thinnest. The true turning point came not from grand battles but from logistics. Athens' empire depended on Black Sea grain shipments, a lifeline Sparta systematically severed. When Lysander captured the Hellespont in 405 BC, he didn't just win a battle, he turned the Aegean into a noose. Athenian triremes, once invincible in open water, now found themselves starved of both timber and skilled rowers, their tactical edge dulled by desperation. The lesson was brutal. Naval supremacy wasn't just about winning fights, but controlling the resources that kept fleets afloat. What makes this struggle so pivotal is how it redefined ancient warfare. The Peloponnesian War wasn't the first to feature ships, but it was the first where sea power dictated a hegemonic shift. Athens' triremes built its empire, and Sparta's eventual mastery of the waves dismantled it. Yet the deeper irony lies in the aftermath. Sparta's victory at sea eroded the very martial values that had defined it, proving that adapting to win can sometimes mean ceasing to be what made you strong in the first place. The waves that carried Athens to glory ultimately became the grave of its ambitions, a reminder that no advantage lasts forever when the tides of innovation never stop turning. Siege warfare in the Peloponnesian War was less about dramatic clashes and more about the slow, grinding weight of starvation and ingenuity. Take Athens' long walls, a marvel of engineering that stretched 4 miles to the port of Piraeus, creating an unbreakable corridor immune to Spartan land assaults. These weren't just barriers, they were psychological weapons, proof that Athens could outlast any invasion by relying on its navy to keep supply lines open. Yet even the mightiest walls had vulnerabilities. When Sparta finally blockaded the harbor during the war's final years, those same walls became a prison, trapping Athenians with nothing but hunger and despair. The lesson was clear. In siege warfare, control of resources meant more than any fortification. Syracuse's defiance during Athens' Sicilian expedition showcased the flip side of this dynamic. The Syracusans, initially outmatched by Athenian siegeworks, turned their city into a labyrinth of counter-fortifications. They extended their own walls to nullify Athenian encircling lines, built hidden stockpiles to withstand blockades, and even deployed grappling hooks to cripple enemy siege engines. What looked like Athenian inevitability crumbled under Syracuse's relentless adaptation. The siege dragged on for 2 nightmarish years, exposing the folly of overconfidence. Athens' initial advantage in engineers and artillery meant little when disease, supply shortages, and guerrilla raids eroded their will. The true masters of siegecraft weren't always the attackers. Sparta's siege of Plataea, a tiny but stubborn Athenian ally, revealed how patience could be deadlier than any battering ram. For over 2 years, Spartan forces encircled the city, constructing a double wall to prevent escape or relief. When Plataeans attempted a daring nighttime breakout, their success hinged on counting the bricks in Sparta's walls to find weak points, a testament to how intimately sieges blurred the line between strategy and survival. Yet even their heroism couldn't overcome sheer attrition. Plataea's eventual fall wasn't due to breached walls, but to the silent, inexorable calculus of starvation. Sieges also birthed innovations that reshaped warfare. The Athenians' use of flame ships at Syracuse vessels packed with combustible materials and sailed into enemy formations foreshadowed medieval fire tactics. Defenders developed early forms of chemical warfare, pouring burning pitch or sulfur onto attackers, and the Spartan invention of the tortoise, a mobile roof of shields to protect sappers tunneling under walls, mirrored techniques still used in modern urban combat. These weren't just battles of muscle, but of intellect, where carpenters and blacksmiths became as vital as hoplites. What made sieges uniquely cruel was their democracy of suffering. Whether you were a Spartan king or an Athenian slave, dysentery and hunger didn't discriminate. The Siege of Milos, where Athenians starved a neutral city into submission, showed how easily ideals like honor collapsed when survival was at stake. Conversely, the resilience of cities like Syracuse proved that morale could defy material odds until it couldn't. In the end, sieges were less about conquest than endurance, a grim contest to see which side's spirit would break first. And as Athens learned in its final days, no walls, no matter how thick, could protect a city from the slow bleed of despair. Money became the unlikeliest weapon in the Peloponnesian War, a silent force that could starve cities, break alliances, and turn the tide without a single spear being thrown. Take the Megarian decree, Athens' ruthless trade embargo against its tiny neighbor. On the surface, it seemed like a minor economic sanction, but the effects were devastating. By banning Megara from Athenian markets and harbors, Athens didn't just inconvenience traders, it severed the city's lifeline. Megara's economy collapsed overnight. Farmers watched their crops rot on the docks, merchants faced ruin, and hunger crept into homes as grain shipments vanished. This wasn't just punishment, it was a calculated demonstration of how Athens' naval empire could strangle rivals without ever drawing blood. Yet the decree backfired spectacularly. Sparta, bound by honor to defend its ally, spun Megara's suffering into a rallying cry, painting Athens as a tyrant bullying smaller states. What began as economic pressure became the final spark that ignited total war. Persian gold proved even more decisive. For years, Sparta struggled to match Athens at sea. Their agrarian society lacked the coin to build competitive fleets. That changed when Persian satraps, eager to weaken Greece's warring city-states, opened their treasuries. Suddenly, Sparta could hire skilled rowers from Athens' own allies, commission triremes by the dozen, and pay mercenaries to bolster their ranks. The infusion of foreign wealth transformed Sparta from a landlocked power into a naval threat almost overnight. Persian derricks didn't just buy ships, they bought time. While Athens' treasury dwindled funding endless campaigns, Sparta's coffers, fattened by Eastern gold, never ran dry. The lesson was clear. In prolonged wars, the side with the deepest pockets often outlasts the side with the best tactics. Resource shortages exposed another brutal truth: no city was truly self-sufficient. When Sparta occupied Decelia in Attica, they didn't just raid farms, they severed Athens' access to vital silver mines and timber supplies. Shipbuilding slowed as wood grew scarce, and the mint hesitated to strike new coins without fresh silver. Even Athens' legendary resilience couldn't compensate for the slow bleed of dwindling resources. Meanwhile, Sparta's allies in Sicily and Egypt diverted grain shipments, turning the Aegean into a battlefield of empty bellies. The real war wasn't just fought on land or sea, but in the aching hunger of citizens and the desperate calculations of leaders counting dwindling sacks of grain. Economics also reshaped alliances in unexpected ways. Neutral states like Milos learned the hard way that neutrality was a luxury only the strong could afford. When Athens demanded tribute, it wasn't greed, it was survival. Every unwilling ally squeezed for funds meant another trireme built, another month of rowers fed. Sparta's liberation of subject cities wasn't pure idealism either. Each defection from Athens' empire meant one less source of enemy revenue. The war's longest-lasting scars weren't just the burned olive groves or shattered triremes, but the shattered trade networks that had once knit Greece together. By the war's end, even victory tasted hollow. Sparta's economy, built for austerity, buckled under the weight of empire, proving that no power, no matter how disciplined, could escape the iron laws of supply and demand. The Peloponnesian War didn't just decide who ruled Greece. It revealed how intimately wealth and war were intertwined, a lesson empires would relearn for centuries to come. Alliances in the Peloponnesian War were less like stone treaties and more like shifting desert sands constantly reshaped by the winds of self-interest. Take Thebes, Sparta's neighbor and nominal ally, whose loyalty wavered with every changing season. Officially bound to Sparta through the Peloponnesian League, Theban leaders privately seethed at Spartan dominance. Their support came with strings attached, often withholding troops or demanding concessions, revealing how even the strongest alliances were built on brittle foundations. When Plataea, a small but defiant Athenian ally, became a flashpoint early in the war, Thebes jumped at the chance to settle old scores, besieging the city with a fervor that shocked Sparta itself. This wasn't cooperation, it was opportunism disguised as unity. Persia's involvement turned the entire war into a geopolitical chess game. At first, the empire watched from the sidelines, content to let the Greek city-states weaken each other. But by 412 BC, Persian satraps like Tissaphernes and Pharnabazus saw gold as the ultimate weapon. They bankrolled Sparta's navy, not out of loyalty, but to ensure neither side emerged too powerful. The irony was exquisite. Sparta, the champion of Greek independence, became dependent on Persian darics to fund its fleet. Persian envoys played both sides masterfully, promising support to Athens when it suited them, then abruptly switching allegiance to Sparta when the winds changed. For Persia, this wasn't betrayal, it was cold calculus, a way to keep Greece divided and manageable. Smaller states learned brutal lessons about the price of trust. Korsaira, whose plea for Athenian help had helped spark the war, descended into civil strife as democratic and oligarchic factions butchered each other in the streets. Neutral cities like Milos discovered too late that neutrality was a fantasy. Athens' brutal siege proved that in total war, there were no sidelines. Even Sparta's vaunted Peloponnesian League frayed under pressure. Corinth, furious over Sparta's leniency toward Athens after early defeats, threatened to defect, while Iles and Mantinea chafed under Spartan demands for troops and tribute. The most telling betrayals often came from within. Alcibiades, the Athenian golden boy, defected not once but twice, first to Sparta, then to Persia, each time leveraging insider knowledge to devastating effect. His treachery wasn't just personal ambition. It reflected a broader erosion of loyalty in a war where survival trumped honor. Even Sparta wasn't immune. When their admiral Lysander grew too powerful, Spartan elites recalled him, fearing his influence more than Athenian fleets. These shifting allegiances did more than prolong the war. They rewrote the rules of Greek diplomacy. Trust became a luxury few could afford, and every handshake carried the unspoken question: when will this ally become tomorrow's enemy? The war's outcome wasn't decided by battles alone, but by the quiet whispers in Persian courts, the grudges of slighted allies, and the gold that turned principles into bargaining chips. In the end, the greatest casualty wasn't any city's walls. It was the very idea that a word or oath could hold empires together when ambition and fear pulled them apart. War doesn't just reshape borders, it rewires the human imagination. The Peloponnesian War didn't merely play out on battlefields and in council chambers. It seeped into the very soul of Greek culture, leaving behind a legacy of art, literature, and philosophy that would echo for millennia. Thucydides, an Athenian general turned historian, didn't just record events, he dissected them with a surgeon's precision. crafting a narrative so stark and unflinching that it became the foundation of modern historical writing. His account rejected the myths and divine interventions of earlier chronicles, focusing instead on human nature, power dynamics, and the brutal logic of conflict. When he wrote that war is a violent teacher, he wasn't just summarizing battles. He was exposing how societies unravel under pressure, a lesson that feels chillingly relevant even today. Theater stages became mirrors reflecting the war's psychological toll. Euripides, the era's most subversive playwright, filled his tragedies with characters broken by conflict. In The Trojan Women, performed just months after Athens' brutal siege of Milos, audiences watched Hecuba and her daughters mourn their fallen city, a thinly veiled allegory for the innocents crushed beneath Athenian ambition. His Hecuba and Andromache pulsed with the despair of refugees and the savagery of victors, forcing Athenians to confront the human cost of their empire. Even comedy turned dark. Aristophanes' Lysistrata, where women end war by withholding sex, wasn't just bawdy satire. It was a desperate plea for peace during the conflict's bloodiest years. These weren't escapist entertainments. They were communal therapy sessions, helping a traumatized civilization process its collective grief. Philosophy, too, bore the war's fingerprints. Socrates, who fought at Potidaea and Delium, emerged from the carnage with profound questions about justice, governance, and the fragility of moral certainty. His famous method, probing assumptions through relentless questioning, was born in an era where traditional values had collapsed under the weight of plague, oligarchy, and betrayal. The sophists, itinerant teachers who argued that truth was subjective, thrived in this climate, their relativism a product of watching cities abandon principles for survival. Even Plato's Republic, written decades later, can be read as a response to the war's chaos, a blueprint for a society where philosopher kings would prevent the kind of demagoguery that doomed Athens. Visual art captured the duality of an empire at war with itself. The Parthenon's friezes, carved during Pericles' golden age, celebrated Athenian triumph with gods and heroes standing tall. Yet dig deeper, and you'll find quieter, more haunting works, funerary steles showing young hoplites embraced by grieving parents, or vases depicting women weaving shrouds instead of wedding garments. Even pottery, the everyday art of ancient Greece, shifted. Scenes of symposia and revelry gave way to images of warriors departing or slaves tending wounded men. These artifacts whisper what the grand monuments shout down, that victory and loss are two sides of the same coin. The war's cultural aftermath reveals a paradox. Even as Athens' political power crumbled, its intellectual and artistic influence exploded. Spartan swords could break walls, but they couldn't kill ideas. The very conflicts that weakened Greece materially enriched it spiritually, forcing thinkers and artists to grapple with questions about power, morality, and human resilience that still resonate. When we read Thucydides today or stand before a Euripidean chorus, we're not just encountering history, we're witnessing the birth of the Western mind, forged in the fires of a war that refused to be forgotten. The Peloponnesian War didn't just end in 404 BCE. It became a lens through which every subsequent generation would examine its own wars, its own follies, and its own fragile humanity. The Peloponnesian War isn't just ancient history, it's a playbook of human behavior that keeps replaying itself across the centuries. Take the danger of overreach, Athens' fatal flaw. Their ambition to dominate Sicily, thousands of miles from home, wasn't just a military blunder. It was a textbook case of imperial hubris. They underestimated the logistical nightmare, ignored cultural complexities, and assumed their naval prowess alone could guarantee victory. Sound familiar? From Napoleon's march on Moscow to modern superpowers mired in distant conflicts, the pattern repeats. Overconfidence meets harsh reality. The lesson: power masks blind spots, and no empire, no matter how advanced, is immune to the laws of overextension. Unity, or the lack of it, proved just as decisive. Athens' democracy, once its greatest strength, became a liability when internal factions turned on each other. The oligarchic coup of 411 BC didn't just weaken the city politically, it shattered the collective trust needed to wage war effectively. Contrast that with Sparta's rigid cohesion, where dissent was suppressed but decisions were swift. Yet even Sparta's unity had limits. Their refusal to fully integrate allies like Corinth into decision-making bred resentment, undermining long-term stability. Today's parallel: alliances strained by unequal burdens, from NATO debates over defense spending to fractures in multinational coalitions. The war's clearest warning is this: without shared purpose, even the mightiest coalitions crumble from within. Then there's the corrosive cost of prolonged conflict. What began as a regional spat between two city-states dragged on for 27 years, draining treasuries, exhausting populations, and eroding moral boundaries. The Melian massacre, the plague's societal breakdown, the Spartan embrace of Persian gold, all were choices made under the grinding pressure of a war that outlasted its original causes. Modern conflicts, from the 30 Years' War to the War on Terror, reveal the same tragic arc. The longer the fight, the harder it becomes to remember what started it, let alone justify its sacrifices. The Peloponnesian War reminds us that time itself is a weapon, turning principled stands into quagmires where survival eclipses ideals. Perhaps the most haunting echo is the role of unintended consequences. Sparta won the war but inherited an empire it didn't know how to manage, hastening its own decline. Athens lost but preserved its cultural legacy, proving that defeat isn't always oblivion. Today's geopolitical chessboards, where trade wars escalate into cold conflicts or regional disputes draw in global powers, mirror this unpredictability. The war's greatest lesson isn't about tactics or treaties, it's about humility. No nation, no leader, no strategy can control every variable. The Peloponnesian War endures not because it answers our questions, but because it teaches us to ask better ones. What are we really fighting for, and what will be left when the fighting's done? The Peloponnesian War wasn't just a fight between two cities. It was a mirror held up to the best and worst of what human societies can achieve. Think about it: Athens, with its dazzling democracy and cultural brilliance, and Sparta, the unyielding fortress of discipline and tradition, both reached incredible heights only to tear each other apart. Their story isn't just about spears and triremes, it's about the choices that define civilizations. The war's 32 pivotal moments reveal a pattern we've seen repeated across history. The same spark of ambition that builds empires can also burn them to the ground. Consider the parallels that still resonate today. Athens' overreach into Sicily echoes in modern conflicts where nations, blinded by their own power, stretch too far and snap under the weight of their ambitions. Sparta's reliance on rigid tradition, while formidable in battle, left them struggling to adapt when the world changed around them. And then there's the quiet tragedy of cities like Milos, caught between giants, reminding us that neutrality is often a luxury only the strong can afford. These aren't just ancient problems, they're human ones, playing out in boardrooms, governments, and even personal lives. What makes this war unforgettable isn't just its scale or its stakes, but its raw humanity. The plague in Athens showed how quickly society can unravel when fear takes hold. The political betrayals, Alcibiades switching sides, the oligarchic coup reveal how trust becomes the first casualty of prolonged conflict. Even the war's end, with Sparta triumphant but hollowed out by its own victory, teaches a brutal lesson. Winning can sometimes cost more than losing. So why does this matter now? Because history isn't just a record of what happened. It's a toolbox for understanding our own world. The Peloponnesian War forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How do we balance ambition with restraint? When does strength become arrogance? And what does it take to survive in a world where today's allies might be tomorrow's enemies? These questions don't have easy answers, but wrestling with them is how we grow. As we close this chapter, I'd love to hear which lesson from the war struck you most. Was it the dangers of hubris, the fragility of democracy, or something else entirely? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read everyone, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into history's echoes, don't forget to like and subscribe for more journeys into the past. Because understanding where we've been is the first step to navigating where we're going. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, the greatest stories aren't just about what happened, they're about what it means to be human.